Praise God. Okay, we want to talk this evening about, well, the last name we left off with was John Pye Smith, and we want to talk about John Pye Smith's flood theory. He is there were other men, I think I told you back as early as 1655. That was the earliest date that we can find in research for someone believing in the local flood theory. 1655, I don't remember the name. It was a Frenchman who believed it. But no one caught on simply because he didn't have the expertise to argue his case well enough to convince enough people. It wasn't until John Pye Smith, the publication of his book in 1839, that we have, and of course, men's minds, even in Christian circles, because of Charles Lyell and because of the rise of uniformitarianism, were simply right for hearing and for believing something like the local flood theory. Then that helps you harmonize the biblical account with the geological account. And if you believe in the local flood, then you're out of the dark and out of the woods as far as trying to explain things like the Grand Canyon on the basis of the flood. You can explain that on the basis of the Colorado River and uniformitarianism. But if you believe in a worldwide universal flood, you've got to explain the things of nature such as the Grand Canyon by some other method besides uniformitarianism. Because the Colorado River does flow down through it, in order to have cut the gorge that it has cut, it would have had to have been there for hundreds of thousands of years, which is exactly what uniformitarianism says took place 100,000 years ago. John Pye Smith lived 1774 to 1851. He was a Presbyterian minister, professor of classical literature and theology, at the Theological Seminary, started to say cemetery, it just comes out, in Homerton, 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 which is part of London, England. He was also pastor for 43 years of the Gravel Pit Chapel. That was the real name of it, the Gravel Pit Chapel in Homerton, England. He even became president of the university at one time, but went back to his position as professor of classical literature and theology. He published a book in 1839 after becoming simply fascinated in geology because, well, the years 1840 to 1860 are generally known as the years of the birth of the local flood theory, 1840 to 1860. And because of Charles Lyell, we haven't mentioned much about Lyell, but we'll cover him more in the future. He's the founder, or the modern founder, of uniformitarianism. Because of some of his brilliant theories about uniformitarianism, then Pye Smith became just completely fascinated with the subject of geology and with the attempts of harmonizing or reconciling some of the facts or the supposed facts of geology with some various portions of Scripture. I gave you the name of his book. I believe it was on the relation of the Holy Scriptures, between the Holy Scriptures and some parts of geological science. The relation between the Holy Scriptures and some parts of geological science. The first edition was put out in 1839, and the fifth edition was put out 3 years after his death, posthumously in 1854. And it was in this fifth edition of 1854 where Pye Smith had written and had contained here in this book 60 arguments in favor of the local flood theory and against the universality of the Noachian. Found on pages 109 through 149 and 264 through 283. 60 pages. Page after page of some very brilliant arguments in favor of the local flood and in opposition to a universal flood. Some of these we've mentioned before, and we're going to try to list some of these here at the end of the message here this evening, some of the biblical, in other words, some of the biblical arguments that he thought that he found in Scripture. And ever since his time, men have jumped on these and used these. Now, Pie Smith's first and basic argument was that the sinfulness of humanity would simply have made a universal expansion of humanity impossible. And he based this on Genesis 6 and verse 11, that the sinfulness of humanity would make the expansion of it impossible. And he bases this on Genesis 6:11. You might want to turn and see the verse, that although it says what he says, that humanity is indeed sinful, it doesn't end up with the conclusion with which he ends. Genesis 6:11. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. Now, you're right. What does it say as far as sinfulness is concerned? Well, mankind is sinful. But does it say because he's sinful, he wasn't widespread? No, it says just the opposite from that. It says the earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. Now, the word earth there is eres, E-R-E-S, and it appears 79 times in the first 9 chapters of Genesis. And only 4 of those times can it properly be translated land. In other words, 75 of the 79 times, the word by the context has to be translated as earth. And this is one of the places where it has to be translated as earth. The 4 times where it can be translated land are in Genesis 2, verses 11 through 13, and Genesis 4:16. Now, out of 79 times, that's a lot of times for this one word to appear in 9 chapters. And of those 79 times, only 4 times can and is, I think in all 3 of those cases, in the King James, you've got land rather than earth, which might mean just a particular local piece of the earth, just a local land, which, of course, is what they're wanting to try to prove with the word. But here in Genesis 6 and verse 11, we've got a correct translation, as we see throughout chapter 7 and chapter 8, whenever the word does appear. It's going to be translated as earth because this is what the writer has reference to. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. In other words, it teaches just the opposite of what they tried to use the verse for. It doesn't teach anything local. It teaches universal, that the earth, the whole earth, was filled with violence, which means then that the whole earth was filled with sin, which means then that the whole earth would have to be destroyed. Now, if you look over in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5, we have another famous verse of theirs. That they like to use in saying that only those who heard the voice of Noah would have been condemned. And they say the Bible teaches that Noah preached to his whole generation. And therefore, if he preached to his whole generation, and only those that heard his voice would have been condemned, that means, again, that the distribution of mankind must have been constricted or confined to the Mesopotamian valley, as opposed to being spread all over the earth. Now, this is one of the arguments that we're looking at now, is concerns the distribution of man. If you can prove that the distribution of man was not widespread but was confined, then you don't need a geographically universal flood. You only need an anthropologically universal flood. And they believe in a universal flood as long as you put the word anthropological in front of it. In other words, a flood that destroyed all mankind. But you see, if mankind didn't live all over the earth, if mankind didn't live in Colorado and Arizona, we're not going to have a flood. We're not going to have the need of a flood in Colorado and in Arizona. Well, what does the verse here say? God spared not the old world. Right away, we've got a problem in the beginning of the verse. He spared not the old world. But he saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. Now they've taken the one phrase, the preacher of righteousness, and assumed that Noah preached to everyone of his generation, which that is an assumption that you can assume, but it's not one found in the text here. All it calls him is simply a preacher of righteousness. Now, to how many people he preached righteousness, we're not told. But the assumption, which would be the correct assumption, would be all those that were around him. And since that is true, and they will grant that and we grant that, that does not mean that there weren't any other people in other parts of the world at the same time. Because you see, this is the whole argument. Over in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7, another verse they use, and it's hard to determine why. I guess there's just not any other better ones to use. You've got to use one that has the name of Noah or the flood somewhere in it. So you're talking about, the right thing. You can't find something over in Matthew that's not even talking about the flood. You've got to find something that's talking about Noah or that's talking about the flood. So they found one, again, here that's talking about Noah, but it doesn't say anything about the distribution of mankind. By faith, Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. Well, that's a very good verse, but it doesn't prove anything as far as they're concerned. If anything, it proves our point, by the which he condemned the world. Now they're saying, well, it's talking about the world only insofar as it's populated, but that's not what it says here. You see. Now, one of the great defenders in last century of the local flood view, I want to read some of his comments from his commentary, written in 1817. This is Jameson Fawcett Brown commentary. And he doesn't have much to say on the distribution. He's got a rather lengthy defense of the local flood theory, and this is not a bad commentary. It's one of the best around. But some of his treatment of creation and some of his treatment of the flood is suspect. I want to read several of his remarks here. This is a commentary on Genesis chapter 7, before I get to the last one that mentions Noah. Now, I'm going to be skipping around here, but I'll put the pieces together because there's a lot of writing. You can see it's small print, and it fills up 2 columns on each page. And there's more than one page. He said, it has long been a subject of discussion whether the flood was partial or universal in its extent. A deluge that should envelop the summits of the highest mountain range known in the world would require a mass to the height of 5 miles above the ordinary sea level, and as Pye Smith, he quotes Pye Smith several times here, as Pye Smith calculates, a quantity of water 8 times larger than the contents of the existing sea. Moreover, a universal flood must have been destructive to the vegetation of the world. Thus, upon the supposition of a strict universality, a new creation of the chief part of the vegetable tribes would have been necessary after the waters had subsided. Geology is against the hypothesis of a universal deluge, for it is now the established opinion that those shells which are found on high grounds were deposited there by previous floods of a violent character, very different from the comparatively tranquil inundation described in the sacred narrative. Now you see, that's been a problem forever. How did the seashells and shark bones get to the very top of the mountains in Northern California? And they're found, of course, all over the world, but those in Northern California are famous. You've got the Sierra Nevada mountains there. What are shark bones doing at the very top of those mountains? One old tradition, one old Jewish tradition, as a matter of fact, this concerns some of the mountains in Italy. You've got the same thing. You've got seashells that come from the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea at the very tops of mountains in Italy. And one Jewish tradition was that pilgrims on their way back to Jerusalem deposited the shells there. But how much sense, I mean, does that really make? That pilgrims carried, shark bones and things just so they could lay them up at the tops of these mountains here. Well, you know what he says here, really he's got all three theories. He's got catastrophism as far as the multiple flood theory is concerned, because he said they were deposited here by previous floods of a violent character, very different from the comparatively tranquil. So he believes in the tranquil theory, that the Mesopotamian inundation was rather tranquil, but yet he's trying to explain all throughout this passage the local flood theory. And we covered all three of those last time. The successive catastrophes, catastrophism. Then we looked at the diluvium. He doesn't believe in the diluvium theory. But he's got the tranquil theory and he's got the local flood theory all incorporated here. Now that is a point that they can't answer correctly. I mean, if he's going to say here previous floods puts the shells there, why not just say Noah's flood put the shells there? You're still admitting there was a flood over there that covered those mountains. You're saying the same thing, but you're trying to get away from a universal one. You're just going to say it was the Pacific Ocean that came over the mountains in Colorado. But what you've got to remember is that water always seeks the lowest level. And if it covers a mountain in California, it has to cover a mountain of the same height in Iran. Because gravity always causes water to seek the lowest level. And you see, you can't just have a mountain and have the water just go up and cover it and not be the same. You got to have the exact same depth all over the rest of the globe, you see. So as soon as you cover Mount Everest, that by definition, since that's the tallest mountain, means you cover the whole globe. You can't get around that. Now, are you following that? I mean, some people evidently can't even follow that. They think the water can just somehow buckle and go over the top of the mountain and not seek its own level and seek its lowest level. Some of you probably been reading Hind's Feet on High Places. If you read that, there's a little poem in there about the water that comes down the mountainside. It always goes lower, 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 because it's always gravity pulling it down to its lowest level. So he's admitting here that a flood did it, but why not just go ahead and say Noah's flood did it? Well, that's the proof right there for a universal flood, because you find it not only in California, but in Italy. Then you're going to have to invent a flood over in Europe, and one in California, and then you're going to have to invent one in Peru, and other places where you're going to find mountains. You're going to have to invent these various flood theories. You just as soon say that Noah's flood put these things there. But you see, there are seashells and shark remains at the tops of those mountains. And there weren't any pilgrims going through California on the way to Palestine. They may have gone through Italy, but not California, though. So they got there somehow. Then he says a large portion, he's talking about the overflow now of the whole land. A large portion of the fishes have been formed by the Creator to live in rivers and freshwater lakes, all of which must have perished by the prevalence of a salt sea. So there's that argument there, that all freshwater fish would have been killed by universal flood. On the hypothesis, therefore, of a universal flood, we must imagine motley groups. Now this is ridiculous, what he's portraying here. Motley groups of beasts, birds, and reptiles directing their way from the most distant and opposite quarters to the spot where Noah had prepared his ark. Natives of the polar regions and the torrid zones, repairing to sojourn in a temperate country, the climate of which was unsuited alike to Arctic and equatorial animals. They outdo themselves, one writer after another, trying to picture in their writings how ridiculous it would have been to see polar bears coming from the Arctic Circle, crossing across the Siberian desert, trying to get to the Ark. And they go on and on and on, painting these pictures of how ridiculous all of that would really have been. But you see, those are some good points there. You see, they got these from John Pye Smith. You see, he came after. This is 1870. Pye Smith wrote in 39, and then his fifth edition in 54. So this is, 16 years later that he sang these things. And Jameson is a good conservative scholar. But they do have good arguments in all of these things. I mean, just take the one there about the freshwater fish. We know they weren't taken on the ark because it never says that anywhere in the account. So what happened to the freshwater fish then? And all these various other things. They've got the arguments, but they're just not thinking far enough, though. Now, this gets down to the distribution of mankind. The human race, as yet, occupied a small tract of Western Asia, their numbers being comparatively few, as is evident from the single fact that the preaching of Noah was within the hearing of all that generation. But where's your proof text? It says that Noah's preaching was within the hearing of all that generation. Well, it's 2 Peter 2:5. That doesn't say that, though. But that's the proof text. See, this is their belief that we've got man localized only in that area so that he would only be guilty. One thing we can quickly point out on that, if you'll turn over to John chapter 1, do you realize, dear friends, that very, very, very few people ever saw or heard Jesus when he was on the earth? Now, that doesn't mean that the rest of them that didn't hear him are not guilty. As a matter of fact, look here in John chapter 1 and verse 10. He was in the world, and the world was made by him, and the world knew him not. But it didn't say, now the world knew him not because men didn't live anywhere except in Palestine. Because we know, and no one would argue that by his time, while men were spread all over the globe. And an infinitesimal small number of those people actually heard and saw him. But yet he said that he was in the world and the world knew him not. Shouldn't he say that only those in Palestine knew him not? No, he says the whole world. Why? Well, simply because the fact that he was here made the whole world guilty. Simply because of the fact Noah preached one sermon to one man made everyone else guilty. And that's what Hebrews chapter 11 says, that he condemned the world by his preaching and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. So if you argue that for Noah, then you'll have to argue that for Christ, that probably there wasn't anyone living anywhere else in the world of his day besides in Palestine, or then verses like John 1 and verse 10 wouldn't make a lot of sense. Now I want to look at a couple of modern examples here, or some modern arguments against the universality of the flood. Two of them, to be specific, both of these based on the distribution of man. Both of these similar to what we've already been talking about. And the first of these concerns the existence of the Native American, which we call Indians, here in North America around the year 10,000 B.C. Now the argument goes something like this. Evidence points towards the fact, according to some people, that the Native American, the Indian, was here in North America in 10,000 B.C. And we know that he wasn't destroyed by the flood, or he wouldn't have his descendants around with us today. In a comparison of the Genesis and the Babylonian accounts of the flood, it would appear that in that comparison, both of these would put the flood at an earlier date, that is, well, really it would be later on this side of 10,000 B.C. Now you see, what the argument is saying, it's a complicated argument, but what the argument is saying is that if evidence points towards the fact that Indians, Native Americans, were here in this country at 10,000 B.C., they were not destroyed by the flood because we still have their descendants with us, and it doesn't say anywhere about Noah being an Indian, then that must mean that the flood would have had to have come after 10,000 B.C. But when you draw together the parallels of the Babylonian account along with the Genesis account, which we're going to look at some of those parallels here now, then it doesn't seem like either one of these would allow for the flood to have taken place that long ago. Let's look at some answers to this. First of all, concerning the date of the Indians, there's no way to prove how long ago they first were here or they first came here to North America. Now, obviously, the Scriptures will show us that the Indian could not have come here until after the flood. He couldn't have been here before. So that much of the argument is debatable because there's no way you can prove that the Indian was here 10,000 B.C. You see, they'd like to get him here that long ago. It pushes back the flood further and further, and as we'll see here with the Babylonian and the Genesis, the Mosaic flood account, we've got problems if we push the flood back too far. If we push the flood back past 10,000 B.C., then we're going to have some problems. Secondly, concerning the Babylonian flood account and the parallels of the Genesis account, let's look at some of these, because there are some very remarkable parallels. But even more importantly, there are some remarkable differences that we see between the accounts. We can sum the various parallel accounts up in saying that in both of the accounts, we've got a flood. Both of the accounts, we have rain that causes the flood. In both of the accounts, people, various numbers, but people are saved by a boat. And in both of the accounts, the boat lands on a mountain. Now the Babylonian account, dear friends, catch the dates on this, dates from 3000 B.C. The Mosaic account, 1400 B.C. In other words, the Babylonian account was around 1500 years before the Genesis account was ever put into writing. Then we have to ask the question, where did the Babylonians get their account? They didn't get it from Moses. They had it 1500 years before Moses wrote his down. Then where did they get the account of a flood and of people in the flood and of people saved in a boat and of a boat that ended up landing on the top of a mountain and the people escaping and repopulating the earth afterwards? Now, if it came after 1400 B.C., when Moses is doing his writing of the Pentateuch, we've got no problem. We'd simply say the Babylonians borrowed from Moses. But I guess you can see my point, or my end point, of what most scholars are saying. Moses borrowed from the Babylonians, because their account was around 1500 years longer than his account was. Where did the Hebrews get their ideas? They got them from the Babylonians. And as Dr. Unger says in his book, Archaeology of the Old Testament, that is the chief belief among scholars today concerning the Gilgamesh epic. That's the name of the account, just like we call this Noah's flood. It's the Gilgamesh epic. And that is the chief belief among scholars today, is that the Hebrews, and specifically Noah, received his information from the Gilgamesh epic, because we know the reverse couldn't have been true, because Moses came after the Gilgamesh epic. But there are some differences that I want to point out between these accounts, and we're going to look at the Gilgamesh epic in another class in more detail and look at some of the tablets that have been discovered. As far as we're concerned, if you interpret your archaeological find correctly, this is one of the greatest discoveries in archaeology, because it vindicates the Genesis account of a flood. Now, there are the differences, and I'll explain those here in a moment. But let's look at some of these differences. First of all, concerning the authors of the flood. In the Genesis account, we've got the one true God, Yahweh, who sends the flood. And in the Gilgamesh epic, we have a multiplicity, a pantheon of gods who combine in sending the flood. Another difference concerns the announcement. The Genesis account, it's announced to one man, Noah. In the Gilgamesh epic, the gods keep all of the material secret until one particular man, Utnapishtim, who is the Babylonian Noah, he's the comparison to the Noah here in our account, receives some secret information that one of the gods leaks out to him. Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim. He's the Babylonian Noah. Utnapishtim. One of the gods secretly leaks out some information to Utnapishtim. And this is how he finds out that the gods are going to send a flood. In other words, the gods are wanting to surprise mankind and destroy all of them. But one of them sneaks the information out to this particular man. A third difference concerns the ark and its inhabitants. In Genesis, the measurements of the ark are 300 by 50 by 30 cubits, with 3 stories and 8 people.
For the continued
Ark are 300 by 50 by 30 cubits, with 3 stories and 8 people. In the Gilgamesh epic, you've got 9 stories. You've got many, many people. And this is the most ridiculous thing of the whole account. Its measurements are 120 by 120 by 120. It's a perfect cube. I guess you know what a cube does in water. Spins around and around and around. They would have all ended up sick from dizziness, dead from dizziness by the time they got through. So right away, the biblical account shows a reality. 300 by 50 by 30 cubits. Could that be done? Well, certainly. 120 by 120 by 120? No way. You wouldn't survive in a 9-story cube like that floating around out on the sea. A fourth difference concerns the cause and the length. In the Genesis account, we've got the breaking up of the deep and the opening of the floodgates. For how long? 40 days and 40 nights. In Gilgamesh, it simply rains for 6 days. Another difference concerns the bird scene. In Genesis, a raven is sent out, followed by a dove sent 3 times. In Gilgamesh, we have a dove, then a swallow, and then a raven. And finally, in the end sacrifice scene, both of them end with a sacrifice scene at the end of the catastrophe. In Genesis, of course, we've got God graciously accepting Noah's sacrifice and making a berit, a covenant with him on the basis of the sacrifice that he's willing to offer there. In the Gilgamesh epic, it says that the gods swarmed around the sacrifice like hungry flies. They'd been without food now for 6 days while it was raining. And they swarmed around the sacrifice like hungry flies. Now you see, what most scholars are saying is that the Hebrews got their material from the Babylonians and then simply purged it of all of its grosser elements and ended up with this monotheistic account of a good God saving his people, these 8 people, like he had told Noah that he was going to do. But in order to hold to the biblical account of inspiration and of revelation and of all the other doctrines of the Bible, we simply cannot assume that the Hebrews got their account from the Babylonians. But neither can we assume that the Babylonians got their account from the Hebrews. Where does that leave us then? They couldn't have gotten their answers from each other. I mean, it simply wouldn't have done for Noah to have received his information and then purged it of all of its grosser elements, and it would have been impossible for the Babylonians to get theirs before Moses unless they had a seer in their midst that saw 1,500 years in advance what Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9 were going to say after Moses wrote it down. So how do we get it? Well, very obviously, we got it from word of mouth, oral transmission, passed down from Noah's 3 sons, but specifically passed down since Genesis 11 and the scattering of the people. At the time of Genesis 11, when we still got all the people together, there's going to be a common story passed down from Noah and his 3 sons of this universal flood. But as you get the people scattered and they break off, all of them contain some portion of truth concerning the flood. Just the fact that they all believe in a flood is very interesting. Every culture in the world that's ever been traced can always be documented, the American Indians, everyone, as having an ancient tradition from their ancestors about a flood. Sometimes it's not necessarily universal. As you see in the Babylonian account, many different things enter into it that aren't found here in the biblical account. How do we explain that? Well, as the men got scattered, the story got distorted. And the polytheism, the worship of many gods, and all of the grosser elements did begin to enter in. But nevertheless, they did all keep some form of a flood tradition. And when you study people, even tribes, if you study some of these tribes that are in very remote places, even groups of people that are disassociated from society, some scholars say, well, the reason why everyone has the flood tradition is because missionaries have shared it with them whenever they were passing through. But the thing is, well, several things. First of all, it's rather unlikely that the missionaries who are going out to preach salvation would have spent a lot of time on talking about Noah's flood to heathen pagan people whom they're trying to get converted. And secondly, some of these places have never been visited by missionaries. Then where did they get their idea? Well, they got it handed down by word of mouth. Now you see, we're going back to the argument here. We are agreeing with part of the argument concerning the early date of the flood. That if we've got the flood dated before 10,000 BC, which it would have to have been, otherwise it would have destroyed the Indians if the date of the Indians was true. Then, since, remember I gave you the date when it was written down, 3000 BC, then we've got to assume that that tradition was handed down by word of mouth for 7,000 years and kept in a rather pure form for 7,000 years. And not anyone believes that. We don't believe that. The flood would have, in other words, would have had to have been closer to 3,000 BC than 10,000 BC, or you're going to lose that tradition. The tradition can be maintained for several thousand years, but not just tens of thousands of years as you go down. Pretty soon you're going to lose that tradition. Now, our agreement with the fact that the flood could not have been before 10,000 BC does not prove anything. Their argument here does not prove anything about the distribution of man. That's the whole point of the argument, is to prove that the distribution of man was not widespread, but it was locally confined to the Mesopotamian region. Now, although we grant that the date 10,000 BC is too early for the flood, and the distance between 10,000 and 3,000 BC is too many years for this tradition to be passed down as correctly as it has, does not mean that we agree with their end account here that man evidently was only localized and therefore the flood was localized. The view doesn't teach that. I trust you follow along with that. Now, a second argument concerns the sons of Noah. The argument goes like this. If the flood was worldwide and man was distributed worldwide, then the flood would have had to have destroyed every man. Which means that among Noah's 3 sons, one would have had to have been white, one black, and one yellow in order to end up with our so-called races that we have today. All of them, you're either white, you're black, or you're yellow. Now, you might be a subspecies from that, but you're still white, or you're black, or you're yellow. Now, they don't ever answer the question, well, then what color were the 3 sons' wives then? But they say, if we end up with the people that we've got today, now how they ever got there in the first place, they don't try to answer, but if we end up with these three great divisions of black people, white people, and yellow people, and Noah's flood actually destroyed all of mankind all over the world, then we have to have the representatives of these races within the ark, or where did we get the races that we have today then? Now, if the flood was confined and didn't destroy man everywhere, we've got no problem. Because there were yellow people, red people, and black people, or white people, yellow people, black people, and white people, that it would not have destroyed in these other places. You see, the red would fit under the yellow. They all fit together. You fit under those three categories there. What's the biblical answer to this? We're not going to get into it, but we're going to state it very quickly. The so-called races do not come about until after the flood. Now, we can prove that very easily. And see, when you can prove that, then you don't have to dream up. You've got three different colors on the ark. You just stay with a Semitic people, a white person. The Semites or the Shemites are white people. They're not black and they're not yellow. So you stay with a white person, and you've got Noah white. And you've got, if Noah was white, and this is what they see, the ridiculousness of the situation, then how could he have three different colored sons then? And that's what they see, and they say, well, that certainly couldn't be true. But then if that's not true, then how did we get the colors that we have today? Well, the answer is they came about after the flood, not before. We only have one color before the flood, and that's white. And it's after the flood we have the colors, and therefore we've got no problem because all of mankind's not been destroyed after the flood. Therefore they've just gone down the same color, and we've got those today. Now we'll be into explaining that more later on. Now I want to list some of the arguments from Scripture that Pye Smith used. I think I've probably mentioned all these, but maybe one previously. But this way you'll have it down. First of all, they say, Pye Smith has said, and it's been repeated and parroted since then, that the universal terms that we find in Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9 are simply used in a symbolic manner. And they give us some examples, such as Genesis 41:57. In other words, just because it says that God destroyed all mankind and every mountain under the whole heaven throughout the whole earth was covered with water, doesn't actually literally mean that everyone was. It's simply using it in a symbolic sense. Now that certainly can be true, because we've got many places in Scripture where the word forever is used, but it doesn't mean it literally. Such as in Exodus 21, where it talks about if you've got a Hebrew slave and his 6 years of service is up and he loves his master and desires to stay with his master, then you can bore his ear through with an awl and he will be your servant forever. Well, he's not going to be your servant when he dies then. So it's using the word just symbolically there, forever. In other words, for a long time. So the argument goes, that's how the words are used here. And an example is in chapter 41 of the same book, and verse 57. Now this is when we've got several years of the famine now that have passed already in Egypt. And Joseph now is second in command behind Pharaoh, and therefore he's in charge of the granary and the stores of the grain, which they've accumulated during the 7 previous prosperous years. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all lands. And does that mean that people from North America came over to Egypt? Well, certainly not. It's just using the word in a general sense. When it says all countries there, it doesn't mean all countries. Because you see, we've got the whole world populated at this time. This is during the great dynasties in Egypt. And we've got the whole world populated here. But that doesn't mean that literally all nations come. So they've got a text, there are many other ones, like I say, just the word forever, that can use the word in a sense like that. But on the other hand, there are texts that use the word and mean just what it says, such as in Matthew chapter 28 and verse 18. And Jesus came and spake unto them, saying, all power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. Well, he's just using the word in the general sense, not meaning all power, but a lot of power anyway. No, he's using it in a literal sense. All power in heaven and in earth has been given unto me. So you see, we can find just plenty of scriptures, and you can shoot each other all day long with your one that proves that all is used universally, and another one could prove that all is used symbolically. So since that doesn't do any good to run in all those other passages and look, we got to go back to the context. Turn back to Genesis chapter 7. We've got to look at the context and look at the way these words are used here in the context. The best place to begin is verse 17. The flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark, and it was lift up above the earth. The waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. Now they say, well, it's just used symbolically here. It means all the hills in Mesopotamia. But see, that's not what it says, though. And if there was something else in the text that would let us believe that, then that's okay. But everything in the text, there are over 30 references here to the universality of the flood found in these 4 chapters. And by references to universality, I mean words like this: all and every and the whole heaven. If it says in verse 19 that it covered all the high hills that were under the whole heaven, well, heaven circles the whole earth. So that would mean all the high hills that are over the whole earth, because they're the ones that are found under the whole heaven. Didn't say under the part of the heaven. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle and of beasts and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man, and in whose nostril, all in whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that was in the dry land died, and every living substance was destroyed which was upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle and the creeping things and the fowl of heaven. And they were destroyed from the earth, and Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. Now it says all and every and only and time again there. And it clearly says Noah only, with those in the ark, remained alive on the face of the earth, which would mean that all mankind was destroyed. A second argument based on Scripture from Pye Smith that we mentioned previously is the fact that Noah could not possibly have gathered all animals from all over the world. Couldn't have done that. He only had 8 people with him, and they had to build the ark. So how are they going to gather animals from all over the world? How are they going to talk polar bears from coming out of the icy waters in the Arctic? And the snowy owl to fly down from the Arctic, and the snail darter to swim from the Tennessee River over to Mesopotamia. Thirdly, no floating vessel that's ever been built could have held all of the world's animals, or representatives of all of the world's animals. And certainly no vessel this size could have been built in Noah's day. Don't these sound like good arguments here?
Yep.
Came from Pye Smith. They're very good. Fourthly, it would have been impossible for Noah and his other friends to care for that many animals for a whole time and get any rest themselves. Feed, water, and then clean up what they didn't like when you fed them, or what didn't stay in them. Where are you going to put all that then? I mean, you can't just open the door and throw it out. The door wasn't open until after the flood. That's true. And then fifthly, a universal flood which would have destroyed all animals all over the world couldn't explain how we get our peculiar animals in their present-day locations, such as our edentates and our marsupials. Edentates are things like sloths. Marsupials are kangaroos. And our monotremes, monotremes. Monotremes are, Australia boasts of the only egg-laying mammals, and they're called monotremes, the only egg-laying mammals in the world. One, the duck-billed platypus, and number two, the spiny anteater. Only found on the continent of Australia are monotremes. And of course, most of our marsupials are found on the continent of Australia. Edentates are found in Australia and South America. But how do our marsupials, our edentates, and our monotremes, first of all, how they get to Noah, and then how they get back to their present location today, since they're not found on Mount Ararat today. Not found anywhere within 1,000 miles of Mount Ararat. And not only that, you say, well, they could have traveled there. How did they get to South America? They would have had to swim across the South Atlantic to get there. And the Indian to get over to Africa. So how did they get to these places? So you see, with all that in mind, it's just about good to surrender your universal flood theory and believe in a local flood theory. That's what most people have done. They've seen these arguments, and you might as well surrender. Because what type of ammunition can you bring up against some of the arguments like this? Now, that's only 5 right there that I've given. We just hit on other ones time and time again throughout the course that we could add along with this. Some of these you can probably think of yourself, that when you get all these marshaling against you, then Pye Smith gave up. And a lot of other people today give up. Because how are you going to explain all these various things? The thing about the olive leaf, to get back to that, how are you going to explain that? And all the other things that are associated with that. Well, we're going to stop there, and we're going to begin looking at arguments in favor of the biblical position of a universal flood next week. So we'll start answering all these questions in next week. Now, as usual, we'll take a quick break, and we'll be back for biblical literature.